Now on BBC Two, it's Politics Live.
Crumbling concrete, bankrupt Birmingham and Prime Minister's questions at noon. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative Deputy Chairman Matt Vickers, the newly appointed Shadow Culture Minister, Sir Chris Bryant, Professor of Economics and Innovation and Public Value at University College London, Mariana Mazzucato, and Emily Carver, columnist at Conservative Home. Today, crumbling concrete continues to dominate the start of term here at Westminster.
Many people across the country are getting pretty weary of a government that's now been in power for 13 years, saying in answer to any question about their own failure, it's not our fault, we couldn't have done anything.
It's a problem that's been known about for a long time, but when new evidence comes to light, I think it's absolutely right the government acts on that immediately, even at the risk of some inconvenience.
Keir Starmer will take on Rishi Sunak in the first Prime Minister's questions of the autumn term. We'll bring you that live.
Oh my God, I've never heard of such a thing in my life. How can the council be bankrupt?
Who is to blame for the bankruptcy of Britain's biggest council?
As soon as I get up in the morning, I'll go downstairs and I'll have a vape.
My vape's like a shoulder I lean on.
Is it time to ban disposable vapes?
Today, we're introducing 3 revolutionary products of this class. The second is a revolutionary mobile phone.
And it's transformed our lives, but was its invention as much to do with government as entrepreneurs? Welcome. Let's start with this headline in the Daily Mail. 1 million on sickness benefits will have to find a job. This is reporting on the story and the changes being proposed by the government to the work capability assessments post-pandemic because of the increase in the number of people claiming sickness benefits. They are going to look at ways of getting these people to search for work and possibly working from home. The question, though, is will these benefit changes actually cut significantly the number of people claiming sickness benefits?
That is the plan. That is the plan.
Will it work?
We've seen what 2.4 million people economically inactive, and we're letting them down actually by leaving people at home without giving them the support and opportunities they need to get into work and contribute to the economy. Because actually having a job is not just about the wage packet that you take home. It has huge mental health benefits. It has huge physical health benefits. I think it's right that we're doing a consultation, an extensive consultation, to make sure we get it right. So that we can enable those people. 1 in 5 of them has already told us they want to go to work. They're interested if they can get the right support, if they can get the right type of job. The last time these categories of unemployment were assessed, it was a decade ago. The world of work has changed massively. We need to make sure that we don't leave anybody on the pile and give them all the opportunities that they might want to.
Will it work, Chris?
I doubt it, but I want it to work.
Oh.
Look, the vast majority of people I know who are on sickness benefits of a variety of different kinds do want to do some kind of work. They're trying to find the kind of work that is possible for them. I've done a lot of work on brain injury, people who've had brain injuries. There's 1.4 million people in the UK. They find it really difficult navigating the PIP process, the personal independence payments process, because 2 things. 1, their condition is one that varies from day to day. It goes up and down, and that's very difficult for the assessors to measure. And secondly, because the immediate tendency, if you've had a brain injury, is to want to please the person who's in front of you. And so you tend to give the best version of what you are able to do.
But an expectation to search for work, if possible, particularly now so much work is done from home, you would support those changes in the assessment?
Broadly speaking, but I have quite a lot of buts here, because I think sometimes I've had in my own constituency cases where an individual ends up being thrown off one or other benefit time and time again. They appeal. They're always put back on, and that just means that people who are sick are spending all their energy on navigating the process rather than living their lives.
But broadly speaking, Mariana, do you think it would work, changing the assessments, trying to encourage people who have perhaps found it difficult since the pandemic, particularly the increase that Matt Vickers was talking about, a lot of it to do with mental health? Will these changes help more people get back into work?
So it might help it if it's part of a holistic policy. So we don't think that one little change is going to somehow solve the lives of these people. For example, if we're not actually at the same time investing more in mental health programs and all the different holistic health programs that can help the people for why they are sick in the first place. So this becomes one of many different types of policies that are geared at a kind of person-specific program. And the problem is that unless it's put that way, then actually can lead to, you know, what we just heard might happen, which is it can actually look like it's solving the problem in one part of the economy, but cause it in another. I mean, we have to remember that many of these investments that we require from the government, it's like climate change. The cost of inaction is greater than the cost of action, right? So if we actually think of all the different types of investments, including how to actually train people to go back into the workplace, but also making sure that the work received is actually good work with pensions, as opposed to the gig economy kind of work, of which a lot of that is being done at home. But we know that even though you're earning wages, your long-term income actually depends on the type of job and, again, the different types of benefits that are associated with it.
What do you think? Can it work? Will it work?
I think it can work. I think one thing that's missing from this conversation is how employers are going to react to this, because it's all well and good encouraging people to get back to work and finding new ways of flexible working that might fit their disabilities or their sickness, mental health, whatever it is. But also some employers are reticent to hire people who have disabilities or who might have mental health issues, and they may not want to give them flexible working. So I think it has to work with employers as well. I don't know what kind of incentives might be introduced for that. But yes, that's something to think about.
Well, let's have a look at the take from the Telegraph. Same story, but they're looking at the timing. Back to work drive shelved until 2025. Why is the government waiting so long? Of course, they may not be in power.
The government's running a consultation on the process, but it's not that we have stood still. We're already investing hugely. Right. If you go down to my local employment hub, it's not Job Centre now, you will see those work coaches in there helping people navigate their way into finding the right job that fits their needs. There is already investment going in terms of the changes to how we categorise people's unemployment. That's going to take... And you know what? We need to get it right, because there's very vulnerable people who are going to be subjected to it.
Well, it could be a Labour government. You're a shadow minister. It could be a Labour government. It could be you. Will you support it? Will this be something that a Labour government would do?
Broadly speaking, I'm very new as a shadow minister,
I know,
so I'm going to be very careful at this moment.
Well, don't worry, even those who aren't new have been very careful, Chris. But anyway, so break the mould.
All right, look, broadly speaking, yes. I want to enable anybody who possibly can work to find work, because it is fulfilling. It socialises you, it gives you a better quality of life. And also there's a point for the whole of the country, which is that we've got roughly 750,000 people who've left the labour market since COVID, and that is a problem for the whole economy. Talk to lots of employers. But there's another problem in this, which is really important, which is the state of the NHS. If you can't get to see a doctor, if you can't get to see a mental health doctor, if you can't get to see a consultant, and you're left waiting and waiting and waiting for a musculoskeletal condition, you are not going to be able to get back into work.
All right.
End of story.
Let's talk about vaping, disposable vapes, particularly this BBC News story. Scotland to consider ban on disposable vapes. NHS figures show a rise in vaping among children in particular, 11 to 15-year-olds using e-cigarettes. And it's an increase of 6% since 2018. They are now looking at possibly banning it, certainly restricting it. It was a subject that Panorama looked at on Monday night. Let's take a look.
I feel really angry. You see, you know, all the kids out there vaping. So, you know, it's massive. It's a massive problem. And I think it's just been allowed just to get way out of control.
I think there's a growing realisation that we've perhaps had our eye off the ball and missed our opportunity to nip this in the bud, and it's going to be a harder problem to solve than it certainly would have been had we taken note, 12 months ago.
There's several things we can do right now. We can place them behind closed doors in shops, as we do for cigarettes. We can reduce the number of flavours. and we can require a prescription.
I think there is a case for plain packaging and keeping these products out of sight of children. Prescription only would be a disaster because that will just push millions of smokers back to smoking.
So, it's been a couple of weeks now. Charlie, how is it going?
The first 3 days were definitely very difficult. It's nasty when you're seeing people doing it around you because it's like an urge inside of you. But I've been resisting it for quite a while now.
Leah has found trying to quit the vapes harder going.
It definitely is a struggle. In my head, it seems so easy, but it's really not.
A huge problem. Should it be banned by the government here?
I mean, I don't know about anyone else here, but I do dabble in a bit of vaping. I've tried all sorts of different vapes, and I think the issue is they are currently illegal for children. Children aren't supposed to be able to purchase them, so I think the government should focus on trying to enforce the laws that we currently have. In terms of the different flavours and the pink sort of neon packaging, I think that probably could be regulated a little more because they do look designed for children, although there are many adults who like tutti frutti flavours too. I don't think prohibition is the right way to go because if you look at Australia, they've gone prescription only, and what you have is a massive black market for these things and a lot of illegal products with even worse chemicals and things in them. But what I will say is they are extremely addictive.
Right. Chris, what do you think? Should the government look at banning disposable vapes?
I'm going to get into much more trouble now.
Go on, then.
Which is to say that my mother-in-law went from smoking to vaping, and it's one of the best things that happened to her.
Well, that's what it was intended, of course. But
so
this is the
I'm not interested in banning. I'm completely against banning. I am in favour of making sure that it's not marketed to kids. And we tabled an amendment in the House of Commons, I think a year ago. Government voted against it, which is a shame. I think it will end up doing something around this because, and I have a concern about all the disposable stuff because it's yet more plastic.
Yeah.
So there are elements that we need to deal with, but I'm not in favour of banning for precisely the reason that the gentleman said earlier, which is that prescription just leads to more people taking up smoking instead of vaping.
Right. You say you'll get into serious trouble. That's because the Labour Party, I presume, then is looking at the idea of banning disposable vapes.
No, I was in trouble with my mother-in-law. Which is much more important that I've mentioned her. Yes, she votes Labour. She's a member of the Labour Party.
Don't obfuscate. Don't obfuscate.
I'm not obfuscating.
What do you think? I mean, when you look at the consequences for families and for children in particular, there is no doubt that whatever the rights and wrongs in terms of it being legal or not, children are smoking disposable vapes.
Do you know what? Vapes had a huge place in helping people move away from cigarettes. We can't underestimate that.
If you're a smoker.
I think our major priority has to be stopping youngsters joining the smoking set. There's a debate around the health benefits in terms of vaping. Then we've got the whole discussion around heated tobacco and whether that's actually healthier than vaping. But I think what the government is doing is it's pumping money. We announced it a little while back into a team of illicit vape enforcement officers. We're making it easier for trading standards to take it up with traders. I think we do have to look about whether we should be regulating who can and can't sell them and licensing the ability to sell them to certain retailers. I think that's something we should look at.
What you voted against.
I don't know that it is, but I think
that's what the vaping industry are asking for, I believe, licensed shops, because at the moment off licences are just selling them to kids, obviously, otherwise they wouldn't have their hands on them.
Or people are going in there and buying them for kids, older kids buying them. I mean, the problem is that was the intention, to help smokers wean themselves off cigarettes and onto vapes. But the unintended consequence has been that children, young children, not fully formed in terms of their bodies, are smoking high levels of nicotine and are able to buy them in the flavours that Emily has been talking about.
And they weren't previous smokers.
And they weren't.
They're going to vapes
exactly. So does that make an argument for banning the disposable nature of vapes?
Well, I think there's two different issues, which has already been raised, but just to repeat, I mean, we need smart regulation. Like, it shouldn't, as usual, become this ideological issue of, do we just allow it to go unfettered, unregulated, or banning? There's something in between, which is a smart regulation. But also, as was just raised by Chris, it's absolutely astonishing that even after Blue Planet, David Attenborough's amazing documentary, that last episode with all these baby dolphins choking on plastic, we somehow come up with this great new idea where people are throwing away disposable vapes in the millions across the world, and it ends up in our oceans. So again, holistic policy, which is looking at both health of people and planet and smart regulation, that should be what we're doing in the 21st century, and not this old ideological debate, prohibit or not.
Slow off the mark on this.
I think there's also a big education piece to be done, that we all understand that that cigarettes stink, they're horrible and they're really bad for you, but we incentivise the idea that you should move to vapes that are healthy. I still think in some public psyche, the consequences, the health consequences of vapes are not necessarily understood. And I think there's now a piece for us to do around changing the narrative on vapes so people do know the consequences.
And not
when your
making it look
kids
like
pick
candy.
them up, you need to know what the consequences
There's also
are.
a massive piece of research that still needs to be done because it's relatively new and we don't know what the dangers are. Right. And I've had doctors say to me, look, I think that in 15 years' time we will say, why on earth didn't we spot what we were really doing to people? So, yeah, you've got to keep this under review. As I say, the most important thing for me is we should be trying to prevent, as much as we possibly can, kids from taking up a vaping habit.
And that is just regulation, when I say just, but regulation and licensing.
Yes, and maybe looking at things that we do about advertising.
They're already hooked by the looks of things.
Well, a lot of them are. I mean, there are 35 countries at the moment that have regulations or bans on aspects of vaping. Does that point in a direction that this is something that will come possibly here too?
Yeah, I think we are heading in that direction. It does seem more and more countries, similar to our own, are deciding to go in tough on this. But as I said before, I don't think it works with these kind of products. There is such an illegal market for them now in Australia, and children are still getting their hands on them. So I'm not really sure if prohibition works, especially when it is such a useful product. It is for smokers, but for others.
But I kind of wish it wasn't the final resting place of former smokers.
But why not? If it's 95%, which is what people say, 95% less harmful. I mean, this is early evidence.
Because you've still got the 5%, I suppose. But also in public spaces, some people seem to think it's perfectly acceptable for them to vape in public space. I mean, on tubes and trains and things like that, and it's not. So I think there's, as with many new things in our lives, we just have to the government has to keep a very careful, watchful eye.
Yeah, but listening to what you're all saying, all very interesting, but are our children then being made sacrificial lambs on the altar of a policy that is designed usually for older people coming off smoking? Chris?
That's a big, a great big metaphor slap bang in the middle of a fairly nuanced conversation.
Yeah, well, yes, but I mean, is that the result of this?
Well, no, because I think what we're trying to... everybody, I think, is saying the same thing. We're in violent agreement with one another, which is very irritating.
It looks like candy, which it does. I mean, those pictures there look, colourful candy.
It tastes like candy as well.
Yes, I know. And, and maybe we should be doing something about
the attractive.
The variety of flavours that are available and what the mix of them is, because obviously some of them have higher nicotine content than others. And
so we don't know how many of these young people wwho are vaping now would have been trying smoking.
You're not.
But the problem is vapes become an extension of your hand.
Yeah, because when I was at school, the behind the bike shed was all about kids smoking cigarettes. So, and if they're doing vaping today, that is obviously better.
But we talked about it. And as I say, it is an interesting debate, but why isn't more being done about it? If the levels of addiction that it looks like are spreading amongst young children, it's going to get worse.
The priority is young children and stopping people joining that market pillar smoking. And there is enforcement being put in. Earlier this year, we announced that we were paying for this illicit enforcement team who are going down there, clamping down on people who sell this thing to young people. Well, it's millions of pounds. But we're also changing the loopholes around trading standards that allow people to sell the non-nicotine product to small children.
But it's not just about children.
Trading standards.
It's not just about children, it's about addiction, right? So the whole opioid crisis should have woken us up to how companies can benefit massively from addictive substances. What have we learned? Not much.
And also, the commercial instinct is not always in the public interest. The Sackler family, opioids, you could say the same for vaping. Whilst it has taken people off smoking, in many cases, they're pushing stuff. And I suspect that in many cases, trading standards now are so stretched, they have no chance of being able to deal with this properly. Local authorities' budgets, as we may come on to...
Well, we will talk about that.
Underage drinking is down, though.
Yes.
So, I think there's always going to be advice for young people, isn't there?
All right, well, let's talk about another addiction, one that I'm addicted to, which is my iPhone. You're re-releasing your book, Mariana, The New Entrepreneurial State. It challenges the idea that the public sector and government can get in the way of promoting innovation. You think they're a help to innovation. You use the development of the iPhone as an example of this. Tell us why.
Well, it's a help to innovation if the innovation policy is smart. So everything that makes our iPhone or any smartphone we have a smartphone and not a stupid phone is due to the technology inside it. So internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, just some examples, were all publicly financed. Now, that's a positive part of the story. The Apple, a great company, Steve Jobs, if you've read his biography, he then invested massively in making this phone very nice, well designed. He actually hired not just tech people, but people who had done philosophy and music. So it's a well-designed phone. It's simple. We all like it. And the question is, how could we actually build a public-private partnership where publicly financed technology, privately financed commercial objects actually lead to an economy that's more inclusive and sustainable? So if instead what happened and happens is that we socialize the risks, right? Because all those technologies I talked about, some of those were successful. In order to get the internet, we had to invest in many failing technologies, right? So this public investment is risk-taking investment. If we socialize risks and privatize rewards, then we're missing the trick. So this is why the new entrepreneurial state 10 years later is all about how do we then structure those kinds of policies. For example, today, the CHIPS Act is a policy I helped kind of inform, where Gina Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce, is about to give, or has given, $400 billion to semiconductor companies. What should be the conditions, the contracts, so that partnership, because it's all about partnership, is a good partnership. And what she's put into that contract for semiconductor companies is those companies shouldn't then just be using the profits for share buybacks. They should pay workers their living wage, improve working conditions, and use green supply chains.
Right. I mean, doesn't the government do that to a smaller extent in terms of the amounts of money that you're talking about, and perhaps not in the direct way you've outlined? I mean, obviously, there is the Department for Science, Technology and Innovation. There is money put aside for research and development. Isn't that a form of what you're talking about?
Since I've moved to the UK, God, I need to remember how long that's been, about 22 years, the Department of Business and Industrial Strategy has changed its name about 4 different times. One organization, Innovate UK, has changed its name about 3 different times. So one thing I think that characterizes the UK economy is this instability, but also insecurity. I often say that I walk in as an economist and I come out as a life coach. It's like, come on, right? So going beyond the ideology, whether it's about the regulation, about vapes, but also about our science, innovation, the kind of public and private co-investment that we need across the whole innovation chain means that, for example, it's not just about the R&D, the research and development, it's also about the whole chain. What does it mean to have public finance, a public bank at the end, which is not just providing inpatient finance, which we have a lot of in the UK, but patient, long-term finance.
So the state is the answer in terms of spurring on great innovation right from its sort of birth to completion.
There's a part to play, of course there is, in terms of research development and in terms of funding when there are particular policy goals. But I do worry about how these decisions are made. We know how many complaints there have been over government contracts in recent history. So who gets the contracts? Who gets the investment? Well, it'll be lobbying. It'll be those with, connections to those in government. And it will be those who potentially have the loudest voices. I don't think the government or bureaucrats or people in Whitehall are the best people to decide where we invest our money. I also don't want the taxpayer to be taking on loads of risk. Because, yes, there might be a reward, but more likely than not, they'll pick the wrong winner and we'll lose all of our money, like we've seen with various infrastructure projects, like we've seen with local councils trying to make investments in property and all of that development, end up losing so much money, and I don't think the taxpayer should take on that risk. Private sector's good for that, in my view.
But it's a chicken and egg problem. My other recent book called The Big Con is all about the outsourcing that we've had from governments to consulting companies. Paying Deloitte $1 million a day to do test and trace was not very smart, I would agree. But that's really because we've stopped actually investing within our public administrations. Lord Agnew, conservative Lord Agnew, said during COVID, we are infantilizing, that's the subtitle of the book, infantilizing our government, when he saw just how much we had spent both during Brexit and COVID outsourcing that capacity. Remember during the London Olympics, G4S, right? We outsource the security, they don't deliver, we bring in the military. So it's a chicken and egg. We have to be investing within government capacity in order precisely for government to work well with business. But what we've seen in the last 50 years is a lack of investment within making our public sector more capable.
Matt?
So I'm obviously slightly more in agreement with Emily in that I think it is the role of entrepreneurs to take some of the risks, and they're the people who have the expertise, the knowledge and the drive, and they're going to pull things across the line. But it's the role of the government, the role of the state, to create the environment in which these businesses can flourish, to enable them, to support them, and particularly in the advent of new technology. At the moment, we're seeing AI, we're seeing the government pumping huge amounts of money into ensuring that we are at the front of the queue, that our guys are the bestest and the brightest when it comes to AI and what comes next. And we're also seeing how, not only at state level, but on an international level, how we're going to create the right regulatory regime around AI to make sure that
But
it's
that's
safe,
not what the
sensible.
history tells us. AI, nanotech, biotech, nuclear, internet. The government required to actually make those early stage investments. It was an investor of first resort, not a lender of last resort. And that requires not market fixing, where you're always too little too late, but actively co-shaping and co-creating the market.
Right,
and the fact
on
that this
that-
country doesn't have the level and the type of public investment to do that, that's a problem.
Well, Labour is promising to invest £28 billion a year, not immediately. They have watered it down or delayed it, however you want to describe it, in investment in green policies, fighting climate change. Is there going to be more of that sort of thing in a more planned economy by Labour, if that's what they choose to do in terms of shaping the direction of industry?
Well, to answer the broader question first, I've never believed that private sector is good and public sector is bad, or the other way around. I just think that they have different things to bring to it. And actually, I would also say that some of the most entrepreneurial people I've ever met in my life run charities. So the third sector is an important player as well. My take is that government is there, in the main, to provide the environment in which business can flourish.
Well, that's...
So classic instance, but sometimes governments are reluctant to do it. Classic instance is... I think I'll get this right, is about mobile telephony. In the EU, they mandated standards very early on. In the US, they didn't. So in the US, if you had a Nokia phone, it couldn't speak to any other kind of phone other than a Nokia phone. Whereas in the EU, we developed, which is why a lot of the big names in mobile telephony are European ones. So doing it cleverly is really important, but you've also got to be, you can't be frightened of intervening when you need to do so. And that's the kind of mix that you've got to achieve. I would not want to be part of a government that was ideologically obsessed with only doing things through the public sector. But I do want to say, on the test and trace, Westminster, it wasted billions of pounds because it went through a private sector for an ideological reason, I think. There was a a better alternative, which was to go through local government, which is what they did in Wales, which is why it worked in Wales and was much cheaper and came in on budget. And in England, it never worked.
But people say that was ideologically going with the public sector, and perhaps the private sector did have a better... as it turned out, maybe not.
Well, my argument would be, at the moment, one of the problems we have in the UK is that our public sector is so denuded. That it really struggles to be able to do some of the basic things. But in this instance, in Wales, we managed to do test and trace much better because local governments...
Nonsense.
Sorry?
Trying to trace people and track them. I mean, in my view, it was
Well, it worked well in my patch.
Let's not stick on test and trace. Brings back memories. Not all of them good. Mariana, is Keir Starmer listening to you in terms of a more muscular state being involved in the sort of shaping of policy that you are talking about?
Yeah, he's talking about, a smart and capable state, and he took on this concept of missions that I wrote a book called Mission Economy 4 years ago, but I've been speaking to Starmer's team about how to actually make sure that the details are right. So, for example, growth is not a mission. No. Growth is a result if you get that mission-oriented approach right. And what the mission-oriented approach is look at the moon landing, where we had a challenge, beat the Russians, which today rings a bell, but it didn't stop there. It didn't stop at the space race. There was a mission, getting to the moon and back in a short amount of time. It required 400,000 people. It required public and private, in the private sector, not just aerospace. So climate change is not just about energy, nutrition, materials, electronics. And, just one quick thing, sorry, it required changing policy. So the first thing NASA did was do outcomes-oriented procurement. Procurement, which is about 40% of every government's budget, is often wasted. So mission-oriented, outcomes-oriented procurement for school meals, which is a possibility for innovation.
Sorry to interrupt. Which is what, and I would also say that spending of itself is not an achievement.
Yeah,
it is just spending. It's only if it actually delivers something. And I'm sick and tired of ministers coming on and say, "Well, we spent X million pounds." We just had it earlier. We spent X million pounds on this vaping, illegal vaping team. I want to see results.
Right. Is that why every minister, shadow minister, I should say, is saying, we're not going to talk about spending, we're not going to commit to any spending, even on the public services that you say have been so diminished?
Well, it would be utterly irresponsible. Today
misses the point.
Today is a year's anniversary of when a British Prime Minister broke the economy by basically making uncosted, unfunded spending commitments and tax cuts at the same time. We are not going to fall into that trap.
Would you like to defend Liz Truss?
We could do the history, we could start going back to 2010 and we could talk about the deficit.
Let's just talk about recent history. On Liz Truss, what do you say in response to Chris?
On Liz Truss, I think we are where we are. I think.
What does that mean?
Well, you know what? They should tune into Piers Morgan and see what Kwasi had to say about it last night.
Don't do that.
I think there are consequences to what's gone on. The government's got an agenda.
Well, hang on, let him respond.
I think the government's got an agenda. We've got the priorities. We know what we're doing. We're going to tackle that inflation, start putting more money in people's pockets. That's the way forwards.
What worries you so much, Emily? You did talk about the ideology behind it. Who would make these decisions? Would it just be a case of more nepotism, potentially, to cronies, which is and has happened under successive governments? How could you ward against that?
How could you ward against that? Well, fundamentally, I think it should be the private sector that's taking risks when it comes to innovation and development of products. They do it very well. That's why we have such fantastic plethora of topics and advancements. It's why places like China, as they adopted free markets, more free markets, freer markets, they became so much more competitive. So I think there is obviously a role for state and private sector when it comes to research and development.
Because some of these innovations, like Tesla, I think you cite Tesla Motors, they got a huge subsidy from the US government to start with. They got a huge US subsidy in terms of setting up the innovation under Tesla.
Yeah, and then Tesla takes that money and private investment as well, I assume, and uses it,
but
and
the
then
point
comes
about
out
Tesla was that
with more
the government
competitive advantage, and it improves its product. That's not something that government can do. It can't get in there and start making the products.
No, but sorry, the Tesla investment's
funding and
important
research,
because,
sure, but I don't think you're expecting Whitehall or government to be, getting their hands dirty with trying to create a better car.
So the reason I wrote the book is precisely because, unfortunately,
Tesla might have been the wrong choice in the long term. Who knows?
The ideology is, OK, we just need government to kind of, for the rules of the game, to fund the basic R&D and then let the market kind of do the rest. That is not the history of innovation. Silicon Valley happened because you had smart, capable public agencies across the whole innovation chain, upstream, but also downstream. I already mentioned outcomes-oriented procurement. That's downstream, as is patient long-term capital through the SBIR program, which allowed small companies to scale up. We shouldn't obsess with startups. We want them to scale, right? So government policies can also help create markets. But, the Tesla investment, hold on a second. The Tesla investment, create markets that don't exist. The nanotech sector didn't exist. It was created.
So government decides, OK, I think we should be doing.
But hold on.
Think we should
Can we talk about Tesla because it's a very important example?
Very briefly, because I want to get on to Chris's book.
The government gave Tesla and Solyndra, a solar company, the same amount of money, about $500 million in a guaranteed loan. Solyndra goes bust. Everyone says, government, it can't do anything. It says exactly what you said before. Tesla does well. It gets portrayed as a private sector genius. What government should have done is presented as a portfolio. If we want a green transition, we need to make different types of investments. And to socialize risks and rewards, they shouldn't do what they did, which was to pick up the bill for the $500 million loss in Solyndra, but also get potentially a share of the success of Tesla.
All right.
Hold on. They thought about it, but they thought about it in reverse. They said if Tesla doesn't pay back the loan, Obama said, we're going to get 3 million shares in Tesla. Why would you want 3 million shares in a crappy company that doesn't pay back the loan? Had they said the opposite, we'll have temporary shares, 3 million, if you do well, which they did.
All right,
let Emily respond, but then we are moving on.
The Solyndra loss.
I mean,
so that's smart government policy.
In strategic industries,
public venture capital.
In strategic industries, for example, it is right that the government is involved in terms of that process.
So a green transition is not strategic?
Pardon? Well,
Tesla was part of the green policy of the Obama administration.
The worry is that the government chooses the wrong technologies, picks the wrong winners, and it ends up costing us huge amounts of money for no gain.
But you're not looking at the history. If you go down a rabbit
we're not going to.
We're talking about Silicon
You're
Valley.
looking at a portfolio. Yeah, but you need the same approach for the green.
OK, Marianne, we're going to leave it. We're going to leave it there because I am going to move on to Chris's book. We're just going to go into the chamber. I can see the minister there, Steve Baker, at the dispatch box. We've got just over 10 minutes until Prime Minister's questions, the first of the new term. I wonder what Keir Starmer will be asking Rishi Sunak about. Parliament, you've written about it, how it is not meeting the high standards and expectations that it should. It needs fixing. Why?
Well, if you ask voters, and lots of people have in recent years, their views on Parliament are worse than they ever have been, and by a country mile. And I understand a country mile means as far as you can see into the distance before you get to the horizon. And I think there are reasons for that. In this Parliament, one of the questions I ask in Code of Conduct is why is this the worst Parliament in our history? Because in fact, it's already out of date, because when I wrote it, I think I said that there were 21 MPs who'd been suspended or had left Parliament for, under a cloud of some kind or other for a day or more during the Parliament. I think it's now at 23. It depends exactly what happens to Chris.
It's certainly the it's certainly the highest.
Which is the highest in our history by a very, very long way.
It is, but isn't that to do with more scrutiny? Isn't that to do with better standards, higher expectations, and so that behaviour is not going to be tolerated?
Well, some of it is a good thing, because when I was first elected in 2001, sexual harassment of staff, and you know, it was a regular thing that older male MPs would slap a woman's bottom, hug them, and so on, and that was all meant to be swept under the carpet.
Well,
and we don't do that now, which is absolutely right. I'm delighted about that. We've still got further to go on that.
Absolutely, Matt. Do you agree?
Do you know what? In that sense, I wasn't around as long as he's been around, so I've only known fairly recent times. And I think scrutiny is a good thing. I think that people being taken to task on these things is a good thing. The one thing that I do think we get very wrong in the system is that these things go on for eternity. They go on for a year. Someone's accused of something. The victim sat waiting for justice for a year. The accused is sat waiting to find out whether... And these things go on way too long, and the process has become too political. And it's all about newspaper headlines. I think it needs to be consistent and quick.
I agree with that, but there's one other thing that I think is actually at the heart of the problem, which is our system is a winner-takes-it-all system, to quote ABBA. Once you become Prime Minister, you can do absolutely anything you want. You determine how long Parliament sits, when it sits, when it goes on holiday, what it debates on every single day of the week. An opposition, another member other than the government minister, can't even table an amendment to.
Well, that of course is changing the system, which you think might lead to a better sort of sense of behaviour and atmosphere. What do you think? Has your attitude, young as you are, changed towards Parliament, Emily?
I think that perhaps we need a better candidate selection process because the Parliament is the sum of its parts, and perhaps we're letting in too many people with, who aren't up to scratch in many ways, whether it's competence but also behaviour standards. So maybe that's something to do. I don't think... I mean, I had a look at some of your suggestions. So a ban on second jobs... I mean, does writing a book count as a second job?
Well, you should read the book, because there's an old chapter.
Expanding the scope of the Lobbying Act, that might be good. presumably that means making it more difficult for people to just lobby.
So at the moment,
for their own
the Lobbying Act only applies to people who aren't working for an in-house organisation, but I think it should apply to literally everybody, and that would have dealt with the Green Sill.
Well, what do you
What
do you both make of what Emily says about the calibre of MPs, the candidate selection, the sort of people that we have representing our constituencies? Well, is that the problem?
A Tory government chief whip, there have been quite a few in the last few years, so I'm not going to reveal which, said to me that that's half of them, he thought that there were people who were elected into this Parliament on his side of the House who should never have been selected to be a council candidate, let alone come into Parliament. And I think it is a serious point that over the... You know, we in the Labour Party too, the book isn't incidentally partisan in that sense. Oh, yeah. Well, it isn't. Or I've tried to make it... I'm a Labour MP.
I'm teasing, no, of course.
I'm a Labour MP.
Well, let me let me just...
Go on. So, for instance, Jared O'Mara should never have been a Labour candidate. And you're absolutely right.
He was a Labour MP in Sheffield.
And actually, I'm proud that one of the things Keir Starmer is doing at the moment is being... I mean, some have said it's... brutal. But I think it's important because Parliament is in such disrepute at the moment.
What do you think? Do you agree, candidate selection?
I think we've seen horrendous examples of people who've got into Parliament who should never have been there. I think there is some questions to be answered about how they got there and what those processes were. But you know what? I think sometimes now, because of modern... Well, an MP is probably one of the most scrutinised people in the country, in that everything you do, everything you've ever tweeted will be seen.
Well, exactly. We have a free press and we have democracy, so we can vote out people and we can find out about their sleaze.
It's not just about MPs, that's about
relatively
politics,
free
right?
press.
We've only got a few minutes to midday for Prime Minister's questions. The list of schools affected, closed or partially closed because of what they call RAC, this type of crumbly, aerated concrete, has been published. The Education Secretary Gillian Keegan said it would be published by the end of this week. Well, it is out there. We will get you the latest on it as soon as we have it. We're going to talk to a head teacher after Prime Minister's questions, who will be putting questions about the situation in their school. They have been directly impacted by this crisis. And it is a crisis, isn't it, Matt?
Do you know what? This was an accepted building practice at the time. In the 60s, we were throwing up buildings with this stuff. It's turned out that it's a massive problem. And we put in place measures over many years, to assess it, to make sure it was safe. In August, there was an incident that proved something that wouldn't have been assessed as critical, was critical and was a huge problem. So I think it's right, actually, that Gillian's gone out there, moved as fast as possible. And you know what? We are being one of the most cautious approaches in the world, in that we're ripping this stuff out and sorting it out quickly. In Scotland, it's apparently going to take months before they handle some of this. I think it's right that we're moving fast. Is it causing a bit of alarm panic? Yes, it's a very small minority of schools, but we need to do this and we need to do it quick. The evidence changed in August and we're reacting to it as quickly as possible.
I mean, the safety first approach is the right one, isn't it, Chris?
Yes, but the safety first approach could have applied 6 years ago when they were very clearly warned about it. It could have applied earlier on this year when there were instances where there were manifest problems. So it's just preposterous that we've got to the day before term starts and suddenly schools are being told that they can't go into schools. And they're not ripping it out. There's no guarantee that there's going to be any new money. Most local education authorities
Jeremy
and schools...
Hunt said he would do whatever it
Yes, but he
takes.
hasn't. He said that there'll be a single penny of new money, and that's what these schools are going to be needing.
Well, isn't that the problem? It does need new money.
And it's a perfect metaphor for the state of the government.
I think the reality is the response was to evidence that came to be in August. We've had a regime in place that assessed how much risk was there. Clearly it failed, and what the professionals and the experts told us was safe, a piece that was not assessed as critical became critical. We know, therefore, it's a moving sands. We've got to get on with it.
I've been in charge of this country for 13 years.
This burden will not be felt by schools, will not be felt by local authorities. It is coming from the government in capital funding so that schools can do whatever they need as quickly as they need to do it to get those youngsters back into school.
But, Matt, you can't get away from the fact we have evidence that there were warnings since 2018, clear warnings. I take your point about a change, perhaps, in the level of regulation or how they regulated or looked at risk, but there have been warnings from within the Department of Education and from people who know about these sorts of things, and nothing was done.
Chris isn't a construction expert. I'm not a construction expert. Gillian Keegan is not a construction expert. So what we do is we deal with the experts who put in place a regime that said these things are critical and need to go. These things are managed risks that you can mitigate and support. But look, in August, something that wasn't critical proved to be critical.
I'm sorry, the first thing you did when you came into power in 2010 was you scrapped most of our building schools programme. And then when Rishi Sunak was asked, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, was asked for enough funding for 200 schools.
Will Labour, will you commit to reinstating or restarting a Building Schools for the Future programme?
You really think that on my first outing as a shadow minister, I'm going to commit the Labour Party to a vast spending
Well, why not? You've just criticised them for scrapping
because they're the people who are in charge of the government and the country at the moment. They've been in charge for 13 years because I have not seen the figures. I'm not going to do what Liz Truss did a year ago. As I said earlier, it is utterly irresponsible of any politician to come on and suddenly say, yes, I'm going to write a cheque for an undisclosed amount.
I mean, Labour have cut all of their spending pledges, basically, so
Liz
Truss
Truss did not get in trouble because she was going to do too much public investment. She got in trouble because she had the most unsensible tax policy that was going to increase the government deficit. We have to talk about what is the source of the deficit. If that short-term deficit is because we're building public schools, we're building green public schools, we're building schools that have good materials, not like Grenfell. Again, I mean, we haven't even mentioned Grenfell, but that should have been the biggest
Mariana,
wake-up call
would you
ever,
like to see Keir Starmer and shadow ministers commit then to the good sort of investment you talk about?
Before, Chris, because it's not about just money, helicopter money. It's how do we actually make sure that public investment is capable, it's smart, but it's building long-term capacity, long-term growth, long-term infrastructure, which is good.
All right, that's what the government should be focusing on. That's what the government should be focusing on, building schools that last.
Building schools that last. I mean, that is the point, long-term investment.
The Building Schools for the Future programme is a mischaracterisation. It only related to secondary schools. There are millions of different schemes that governments put out, and in school funding there are several different ones. In my part of the world, we've got 57.5 million. The Department for Education's capital budget went up by 25% under Rishi Sunak as the Chancellor, completely mischaracterising to say that one scheme was reduced. That is simply not the case. In my part of the world, £57.5 million going into local schools, building new teaching blocks, putting in new school halls. Brilliant investment and unprecedented. And it's not attached to PFI that costs my local hospital £1 million a week.
Classic trick here. of saying that the money's gone up without mentioning the inflation that went up at the same time.
In terms of inflation...
Absolutely, yes. So my point is, Rishi Sunak was also asked by the Department for Education, as we know from the Permanent Secretary the other day, for enough money to be able to do up 200 schools, and they ended up doing 50. And in fact, only 4 have been done.
There's a difference between rebuilding a school and investing in a school that might build a new teaching block, that might invest in...
Oh, yes, no, because we know what you mean by a new hospital. When you say 40 new hospitals, you don't actually mean 40 new hospitals. You mean a wing in a new hospital, and you're not...
Let me just ask...
Paid for today, not by PFI.
I mean, what is this?
Never.
How damaging is this as the start of term, as a metaphor, I think Chris said, in terms of the state of the country?
Well, it certainly feeds into the narrative that Britain isn't working. I think that's pretty clear, and that, you know, our public services aren't functioning as they should be. I mean, it's a gift to Labour. I mean, their marketing tools, their advertising on social media has been killer. And Conservatives are putting out, you know, things that look like, you know, I could do them on my graphics. So I think they're giving a lot of ammunition to the Labour Party at the moment, the Conservatives are. Let's just put it that way.
Do you think Gillian Keegan's been too cautious in terms of her response?
What, in terms... I mean... She came out fighting a little bit. I mean, it's pretty clear that she doesn't think that it's her fault, and I think that's fair to say that it isn't, because she's only been in the job for,
But I mean
10,
too
11
cautious
months.
in terms of closing or ordering these schools to be closed or partially closed.
I don't know. I'm not an engineer.
Fair enough.
Well, a very senior Tory came out of the chamber after listening to Gillian Keegan supposedly defending the government position the other day, and said to me, "We've lost the next election because of this and because of her."
I don't think it's because of this.
No, I think it's a long list, but it's just one of many.
What do you think?
Do I think she's been too cautious? I think if she was... No. She's been more cautious than most of the other people in the world who are dealing with this issue.
Yeah.
I think it's the right thing to do, to put safety first for youngsters. Despite the political fallout, it's the right thing to do. We need to get on with it.
Let's go in.
We are all incredibly proud of them. Mr. Speaker, I also know the whole House will want to join me in sending condolences to the family, friends and colleagues of Sergeant Graham Saville. It is a testament to his bravery that he died in the line of duty, and a terrible reminder of the work the police do every day to keep us safe. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Louis French. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Labour Party used to claim that it represents working-class people. But Labour's ULEZ expansion to Greater London will now hammer millions of working people with bills of £12.50 per day or £4,500 per year. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that it's unacceptable for Londoners and those in surrounding counties to face this regressive and unacceptable tax? And will he do everything that he can to help working people?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I agree with my honourable friend. It is disappointing that last week the Labour leader allowed the Labour mayor to introduce ULEZ, charging hard-working people £12.50 every time they start their car, adding to their burden of the cost of living. All I can say, Mr. Speaker, is while we focus on helping hard-working families, all he does is punish them.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in congratulating the Lionesses and his comments about Sergeant Saville? I think we all speak for the whole House when we speak on that subject. I'd also like to extend the warmest welcome to our new Labour member for Selby and Ainsty. He's already made history for the Labour Party by overturning the largest Tory majority ever in a by-election. And I'd also welcome the honourable members for Uxbridge and South Ruislip, Somerton and Frome. Mr. Speaker, the roof of Singlewell Primary School in Gravesend collapsed in May 2018. Thankfully, it happened at the weekend and no children were injured. The concrete ceiling was deemed dangerous and liable to collapse, and everyone knew the problem existed in other schools. Yet the Prime Minister decided to halve the budget for school maintenance just a couple of years later. Does he agree with his Education Secretary that he should be thanked for doing a good job?
Mr. Speaker, I know how concerned parents, children and teachers are, and I want to start by assuring them that the government is doing everything it can to fix this quickly and minimise the disruption to children's education. We make no apology for acting decisively in the face of new information. And let me provide the House with an update on where we are. Of the 22,000 schools in England, the vast majority won't be affected. In fact, in 2/3 of inspections of suspected schools, RAC is not actually present. And to tackle the 1% of schools that have been affected so far, the 1%, we are assigning each of those schools a dedicated caseworker and providing extra funding to fix the problem. In the majority of cases, children will attend school as normal, and the mitigations take typically just days or weeks to complete. We will do everything we can to help parents, support teachers, and get children back to normal school life as quickly as possible.
Keir Starmer.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Wood Green Academy in Sandwell was on Labour's building list in 2010. They scrapped it, and now children there are in a crumbling school. The head of the National Audit Office accuses him of taking a sticking plaster approach. The NAO report says he cut £869 million. The person who ran the Department for Education says he is personally responsible. Now, on Monday, he leapt to his own defence, saying it's utterly wrong to blame him. So why does literally everyone else say it's his fault?
Mr. Speaker, the professional advice from the technical experts on RAG has evolved over time, and indeed it is something that successive governments have dealt with, dating back to 1994, Mr. Speaker. Now, as new advice has come forward, the government has rightly, decisively and swiftly acted in the face of that advice. But he talked about school budgets and talked about what I had done, but let me just walk him through the facts of actually what that spending review did, because he brought it up. Well, no, he's brought it up, so presumably he would like to hear the facts. Funding for school maintenance and rebuilding will average £2.6 billion a year over this Parliament as a result of that spending review, which represents a 20% increase on the years before. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, far from cutting budgets, as he alleges, the amount spent last year was the highest in a decade. That spending review maintained, Mr. Speaker, that spending review maintained the school rebuilding programme, delivering 500 schools over a decade, a pace completely consistent with what had happened previously. And, Mr. Speaker, it is worth pointing out that during the parliamentary debates on that spending review, the Labour Party and him did not raise the issue of RAC one single time. So before he jumps on the next political bandwagon, he should get his facts straight.
Mr. Speaker, Carmel College in Darlington was on the Labour's building list in 2010. They scrapped it, and now children there are in a crumbling school. And on the one hand, we have him saying it's nothing to do with him. On the other side, we have the facts. And there's a simple way to clear this up. Why doesn't he commit to publish the requests from the Department of Education for the school rebuilding programme and what risks he was warned of before he turned them down?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman has now brought up twice the Labour school rebuildings programme. He's now brought it up twice. So let's just look at that and look at the facts surrounding that, because we do know the truth about that programme, Mr. Speaker, because the NAO, as he's called on, actually reviewed that programme later on. What did they find? They found that Labour's school rebuilding programme actually excluded 80% of schools. Next, what did they find? That it was a third more expensive than it needed to be, needlessly wasting resources that have gone to schools. And Mr. Speaker, this is the worst bit. The worst bit is that programme, because now he's talking about the physical condition of schools, that programme only allocated funds solely on the basis of ideology, with no regard whatsoever to the physical condition of schools, Mr. Speaker. That's why the independent James Review described that programme as time-consuming and expensive, just like the Labour Party.
well, we don't want to start off with somebody leaving so early, because that's what's going to happen. Keir Starmer.
Well, Mr Speaker, they want more, so let me continue. Ferryhill School in County Durham was on Labour's building list in 2010. They scrapped it, and now children there are in a crumbling school. The truth is, this crisis is the inevitable result of 13 years of cutting corners, botched jobs, sticking plaster politics. It's the sort of thing you expect from cowboy builders, saying that everyone else is wrong, everyone else is to blame, protesting they've done an effing good job, even as the ceiling falls in. The difference, Mr Speaker, is that in this case, the cowboys are running the country. Isn't he ashamed that after 13 years of Tory government, children are cowering under steel supports, stopping their classroom roof falling in?
No more. Just seriously, I will calm down. First session, I understand people are excited to be back at school, but we expect better behaviour, Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, this is exactly the kind of political opportunism that we've come to expect from Captain Hindsight over here. Before today, he's never once raised this issue with me across this dispatch box. It wasn't even worthy of a single...
It's the same for this side as well. Can I just say, we're going to have a calmer question times going forward. I want to hear the question, I want to hear the answers, just like your constituents, Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, before today, he never once raised this issue with me in Parliament. It wasn't even worthy of a single mention in his so-called landmark speech on education this summer. And if we'd listened to him, our kids would have been off school and locked down for longer. It's as simple as that. He talks about 13 years. Well, let's see what happened. When we came into office, 2/3 of schools were good and outstanding. Now it's 90%, Mr Speaker. We introduced the pupil premium to get more funding to the most disadvantaged pupils, Mr Speaker. Today, they are 75% more likely to go to university. And as a result of our reforms, we now have the best readers in the Western world, Mr Speaker. That's what 13 years of education reform gets you, all of which opposed by the party opposite.
Well, it claims to be a man of detail. There are 100 parliamentary questions from this side on this issue and an Opposition Day motion. But, Mr Speaker, let us continue. Holy Family Catholic School in Bradford was on the Labour building list in 2010. They scrapped it, and now children there too are in a crumbling school.
Mr Holden, I think I've heard enough. No then, this is the last time you make your mind up. You either go now or you're quiet for the rest of us.
And, Mr Speaker, if you can believe it, in April this year, the Education Secretary signed a contract for refurbishment of her offices. It's got her personal stamp of approval on it. It cost, I can't quite believe this, £34 million. Can he explain to parents whose children aren't at school this week why he thinks a blank cheque for his Tory minister's office is better use of taxpayers' money than stopping schools collapsing?
Well, Mr Speaker, what I'd say to parents is, in the receipt of new information, we have acted decisively to ensure the safety of children and minimise disruption to education, as we have laid out and communicated extensively. That is the right thing to do. And I would also gently point out to him, Mr Speaker, whilst the Department for Education started this process 18 months ago in spring of last year, as far as I can tell, in Labour-run Wales, they still don't know which schools are affected, Mr Speaker. But again, he brought up this issue of funding, Mr Speaker. And again, let's look back to what happened in that spending review. Because in that spending review, I increased the Department for Education's capital budget by 25% to a record £7 billion, Mr Speaker. It tripled the amount that we spend on children with special education needs and disabilities. It improved the condition of the overlooked FE estate, and it set the course for per-pupil funding to be the highest ever. But it also, Mr Speaker, crucially, invested £5 billion to help our pupils recover the lost learning from COVID. £5 £5 billion, Mr. Speaker, and he might remember that, because we wanted pupils learning, he wanted longer lockdowns.
Keir Starmer.
I think he just doesn't get how this "it's all fine out there" is so at odds with the lived experience of millions of working people across this country. And, Mr. Speaker, let's go on. This is a long list. At least 6 schools in Essex were on Labour's building list in 2010. They scrapped them, and now children there are in crumbling schools. What he won't admit is the reason he cut these budgets, ignored the warnings, is quite simple. Just like he thought his tax rises were for other families to pay, he thinks his school cuts are for other families to endure. Doesn't it tell you everything you need to know? That he's happy to spend millions of taxpayers' money sprucing up Tory offices, billions to ensure there's no VAT on Tory school fees, but he won't lift a finger when it comes to protecting other people's schools, other people's safety, other people's children.
Mr. Speaker, I know he comes here with these prepared scripts, but he hasn't listened to a single fact of 6 questions about the record amounts of funding going into schools, about the incredible reforms to education impacting the most disadvantaged children in our society, a record that we're rightly proud of. And yes, of course we can name the schools. That's because we are reacting to information and publishing that information, Mr. Speaker, so we know where the issues are, something that we're still waiting for by the Welsh Government in Wales. But, Mr. Speaker, of course he wants to try and score political points of something that we are dealing with in the right and responsible way. But I do note that he has not mentioned a single other thing that has happened since we last met across these dispatch boxes, Mr. Speaker. He talked about hard-working families across Britain, but what's happened? Energy bills, down, Mr. Speaker. What's happened to inflation? Down, Mr. Speaker. What's happened to small boat crossings? Down, Mr. Speaker. And when it comes, Mr. Speaker, and when it comes to economic growth, what's happened? It's gone up, Mr. Speaker. He tried time and time again to talk down the British economy, but people weren't listening, thankfully. His entire economic narrative has been demolished, and the Conservatives are getting on delivering for Britain.
There will be more. Nicola Richards.
Against a backdrop of improving economic news, inflation falling, energy bills coming down, growth up, people in the West Midlands are disappointed to see that Labour-run Birmingham City Council has gone bankrupt. As a Sandwell resident and a West Bromwich MP, I'm no stranger to Labour incompetence. Does the Prime Minister agree that Labour have demonstrated yet again that they always run out of other people's money?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is exactly right. We started by hearing how Labour in London are charging hard-working people with ULEZ. Now we're hearing about how Labour in Birmingham are failing hard-working people, losing control of taxpayers' money and driving their finances into the ground. They've bankrupted Birmingham, Mr. Speaker. We can't let them bankrupt Britain.
We come to the leader of the SNP, Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, the public needs no reminding that today marks a year since the Prime Minister's predecessor took office. And upon her speedy departure, they will have thought that things were going to get better. But when we look at unemployment figures, they're higher. When we look at food prices, they're higher. When we look at mortgage rates, they're higher. And economic growth is stagnant. So can I ask the Prime Minister, when is he going to get off his backside and do something about it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think what the honourable gentleman failed to point out is that the amount of times I've sat across the dispatches from him and his colleagues and heard how somehow we were a laggard when it comes to growth, Mr. Speaker. What he didn't do is take the opportunity to correct the record today, now that the figures have been published, which demonstrate, in fact, we had the fastest recovery out of any European economy after COVID.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the Prime Minister thinks everything is all right. But let's look at his proposals for the winter when it comes to a cost of living package. Because when it comes to energy bills, his plan, of course, is to do nothing. When it comes to mortgage bills, his plan is to do nothing. And when it comes to food bills, his plan is to do nothing. So when the when the Secretary of State for Education said earlier this week that everyone was doing nothing, she was referring to the Prime Minister, wasn't she?
Mr. Speaker, I think he's a little bit out of practice, because when it comes to energy bills, what we have done is pay for around half of a typical family's energy bill over the past year. It's support worth £1,500, Mr. Speaker, benefiting families in Scotland. He asks about mortgages, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor's Mortgage Charter covers 90% of the mortgage market and ensures that a typical mortgage holder can save hundreds of pounds a month when it comes to their mortgage refinancing. And when he talked about energy, thanks to the actions of this government, we are supporting the hundreds of thousands of jobs in the Scottish oil and gas industry, securing this country's energy supply, something that he opposes. I will always do what's right for the people of Scotland, Mr. Speaker, and it's time the SNP did the same.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was delighted when the Prime Minister last year said that on his watch we would not lose swathes of farmland to solar applications, instead rightly arguing for solar to be installed on rooftops. Yet my constituency sees a constant flow of planning applications for solar farms and battery storage plants on food-producing land. So can I ask my right honourable friend, when will his pledge become a reality?
Yeah, quite right. Quite right.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes an excellent point. Now, solar is one of the cheapest forms of electricity generation, so it's right that we try and see more of it across the country. But we do need to protect our most valuable agricultural land so that they can produce food for the nation and increase our food security. And that's why, thanks to our changes, the planning system now sets this out explicitly with a clear preference for brownfield sites. Now, of course, we want to do more to encourage barn-top solar, Mr. Speaker, and DEFRA will be updating the House with further information on that policy in due course.
Andrew Bridgen.
Speaker, last week the Prime Minister stated that he was proud of his furlough scheme. I wonder, Mr. Speaker, if he's equally proud of the 400 billion it put on the national debt and the inflation it's caused. Was he proud of the jobs lost, businesses closed and lives crushed due to the lockdowns? Is he proud of the increased NHS waiting list, premature deaths and the 1 million young people now needing mental health support? And finally, Mr. Speaker, is he proud of the excess deaths affecting every one of our constituencies that nobody wants to talk about? And will he give an undertaking to the British public, a solemn undertaking that they will never be inflicted upon them ever again?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the honourable gentleman knows, there is a formal inquiry regarding COVID which will examine all the decisions that were made, including lockdown and the impacts of them. But with regard to the furlough scheme, Mr. Speaker, I am proud that at a time of extreme anxiety in the country, facing an unprecedented situation, that this government put its arms around the British public to ensure that we protected 10 million jobs. And as the report from the ONS showed last week, those actions, combined with all the other things we did to support the economy, ensured that we had the fastest recovery through the pandemic of any European nation.
Dr. Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a nation of animal lovers, the Conservatives' government record on animal welfare is a source of great pride. But sadly, too many abuses remain, from pet theft, the smuggling of puppies and heavily pregnant dogs and dogs with their ears horrifically cropped, to the illegal export of horses to Europe for slaughter. These issues are personal to me as a veterinary surgeon and to my constituents, especially animal theft and livestock worrying. Can the Prime Minister reassure the House that animal welfare is a key government priority and that he will bring forward the necessary legislation to tackle these issues as soon as possible?
Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for both raising this issue but also his work and expertise in the area. I'm proud that thanks to the actions that previous governments have taken with regard to things like cat microchipping, the ivory ban, or indeed raising the maximum sentence for animal cruelty to 5 years, we are now the highest-ranked G7 nation when it comes to World Animal Protection Index. But we are determined to go even further and deliver on our manifesto commitments individually during the remainder of this Parliament.
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has said he'll lead a government of honesty, accountability and integrity. So can the Prime Minister explain how he was found to have breached the Code of Conduct, this time for failing to declare his wife's shares in a childcare agency which received a monetary boost from measures in his budget?
Mr. Speaker, if the Honourable Lady reads the full transcript and the full findings, she will see a detailed explanation of what happened, which the Commissioner described as a minor and inadvertent breach, but given that at the time I was not aware of the policy that was being discussed with me and corrected it later on and could have corrected it with slightly different language. She'll also know that I'm not the only person across these dispatch boxes that has had the same thing happen to them.
John Penrose. Mr. Speaker, can I interest the Prime Minister in proposals from the Carbon Competitiveness Commission, which I chair, which would deliver net zero cheaply and without deindustrialising our economy? It would help British manufacturers placing imports from countries with lower energy costs, make our exports more competitive everywhere and cut fuel duty here at home. We have strong backing from Britain's heavy industries, cross-party support from the excellent member from Aberavon, who I see is also on the order paper. So would the Prime Minister consider adding his name to our list of supporters as well?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend and the Commission for Carbon Competitiveness for the report that he's worked on and highlighted. The government is absolutely committed to putting in place the necessary policies for UK industry to decarbonise successfully. As he'll be aware, government recently consulted on addressing carbon leakage in particular with a range of potential options. We're in the process of considering those responses and will issue a formal response in due case.
Claire Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every year, billions of wet wipes go out into our rivers and oceans and clog up our sewers. Yeah. I've been campaigning on this for years to ban plastic in wet wipes, and the government has finally promised to ban plastic in wet wipes, but that was 5 months ago and there's been nothing since then. So will the Prime Minister today finally give a date when that ban will come into force and make a difference to our environment? Or is this another broken promise from his zombie government?
Speaker, in the comprehensive plan for water that was published by the Environment Secretary in April, we did confirm our intention to ban wet wipes containing plastic, subject, of course, as is legally proper, subject to a public consultation. That consultation will be launched in the coming months in autumn of this year, and I know ministers will keep the House updated on progress.
Craig McKinley.
I'd like to offer some assistance on the small boats issue. Has my right honourable friend considered the incongruity of the fact that a UK dinghy manufacturer trying to sell into the EU market would have to apply the CE marking, customs codes and the potential of being stopped and checked? And similar applies, perversely, when a simple thing like GB to NI trade. But none of this applies, seemingly, when these huge, supersized, dangerous, cut-and-shut dinghies are taken in from Turkey across the EU border into Bulgaria and Greece. Is he as confused as I am by the EU's double standards on this matter?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right that we must do all we can to stop the boats and tackle illegal migration. And we know that the export of small boats across parts of the European continent is a vital element of the smuggling gang's tactics. And that's why, specifically, we are stepping up joint operations with Turkey, Mr. Speaker. And I raised this with the President when we spoke, so that we can tackle organised immigration crime and specifically disrupt the supply chain of boat parts that are used for these dangerous crossings. And I will continue to keep him updated on our progress.
Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 years ago in Plymouth, we lost 5 people in the worst mass shooting the country has seen for a decade. The government has finally consulted on firearms reform, but after pressure from shooting groups, even these sensible measures looks like they could be watered down. So will the Prime Minister bow down to lobbyists from the shooting industry, or will he stand with the grieving families and those in Plymouth who want to see no other tragedy like this ever happen again with stronger gun laws?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know how important this issue is to the honourable gentleman following the horrific shooting in his constituency, and my thoughts are with the family of all those who were killed. He will know that firearms are subject to stringent controls, and rightly so, but those controls are kept under constant review. For example, we've taken action to improve information sharing between GPs and the police to make sure that people are not given access to firearms without their medical conditions being checked, and the statutory guidance for chief officers of police have been improving so that how people apply for firearms is assessed properly, including checks on social media. With regard to the matter that he specifically raises, the Home Office is in the process of considering responses to that consultation and will respond in due course.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Later today, Mr. Speaker, I'm bringing forward a 10-minute rule bill to include the provision of automated external defibrillators in all new housing developments of 10 dwellings or more. Will my right honourable friend therefore support this provision and ask his relevant cabinet colleagues to engage with me to ensure these life-saving pieces of equipment can become commonplace where they can have the most impact close to people's homes?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right to highlight the importance of these life-saving devices, and that's why the National Planning Policy Framework already expects planning policies and decisions to promote public safety, but it's also why recently the government launched a £1 million fund which will place around 1,000 new defibrillators in communities across England to help improve equality of access to these life-saving devices.
Andy MacDonald.
In 2019, Outwood Academy's Riverside Free School application in Middlesbrough was approved, with its first Year 7 intake arriving the following year. And that has happened every year since, but there's still no new building. I've had no response to my request for a meeting with the Secretary of State, but that original intake are destined to spend their entire secondary education in various temporary adapted premises. Mr. Speaker, with pupils being shunted around old buildings, talk of levelling up and addressing the GCSE attainment gap rings hollow. So can the Prime Minister and his Education Secretary get off their derrieres and sort this out?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to ensure that the honourable gentleman gets an answer to the specific question he raised on the school. But more generally, I'm proud of what the government's doing in Teesside and the Tees Valley to support education, with the recent announcement of new sixth forms, but also as an education improvement area, receiving extra funding and resources. And that's why we've seen standards in reading and maths increase considerably, and we're determined to keep going.
Priti Patel.
Speaker, the Prime Minister is aware of how the RAC issue has really affected schools in Essex. We've got a high number of schools that have been impacted, and he's rightly said today that the government's doing everything it can to get children back to school. Can he try to commit, and I know there's a debate later on today, to fully funding both the capital and revenue costs that are associated with getting children back into school? And I would hope that he would commit to meeting the leader of Essex County Council, because they are pioneering some great reforms right now where they're looking to support, maintain schools, as well as academy trusts. And I think actually the government could get some good insights in terms of how we can get children back to school fast, and also look at the funding model for this.
Can I first of all start by thanking my right honourable friend for the engagement constructively that she's had with the department, and indeed pay tribute to her school leaders and local authority for everything that they are doing. I am happy to give her the reassurance, as the Chancellor already said, new funding will be provided to schools to deal with this issue, but also to ensure that we can get through this as quickly as possible for her constituents and parents, and indeed everyone's. DFE are in the process of increasing the number of dedicated caseworkers from 50 to 80. We have 35 project directors regionally on the ground to support, and we've increased the number of survey firms by more than double, Mr. Speaker, so that we can rapidly, over the next few weeks, fully assess all the relevant schools and have a mitigation plan in place.
Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Steelworkers in my Aberafon constituency have watched in frustration as other governments have pumped investment into decarbonisation, whilst successive Tory governments have sat on their hands. So when will the Prime Minister finally conclude the talks with Tata Steel, and can he guarantee that there will be a matching level of investment with what other European governments are doing on decarbonisation? And will he guarantee that the conclusion will be based on serious engagement comprehensively with the steel unions?
Well, Mr. Speaker, steel is absolutely vital to the UK. This is something that, of course, is of interest to the honourable gentleman, but something that I've also discussed extensively with my honourable friend from Scunthorpe, and that's because the industry supports local jobs and economic growth. Now, conversations with specific companies like Tata are ongoing, but they are understandably commercially sensitive. But we do share the ambition of securing a decarbonised, sustainable and competitive future for the industry in this country. And in the meantime, we are supporting the sector, Mr. Speaker, with our energy industry's exemption, which provides discounted energy bills, and the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund, which supports steel companies with their energy bills and the transition through capital to a greener future.
Mark Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 weeks ago, the government announced that the Bolsover Schools bid for a sixth form in my constituency has been successful. 52% of school leavers at 16 years old across the country go on to a sixth form. But in Bolsover, it's 23%, in Clown, 22%, and in Shirebrook, it's 7%. So will the Prime Minister join me in thanking the Redhill Academy Trust, Matthew Hall, the head teacher of Bolsover School, and all of those who have helped to bring a sixth form to Bolsover?
Well, can I congratulate Redhill and everyone involved with the successful bid for the new sixth form in Bolsover. I'm delighted that the bid was successful because my honourable friend, I know, shares my desire to ensure a world-class education for every single one of our young people across the country, because that is the best way to provide them with the opportunity for a better life, and this new programme of sixth forms will deliver that in his constituency and many others across the nation.
Ian Mans.
Very grateful, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the North East has been underfunded in terms of transport investment for decades. HS2, meant to be an economic development and connectivity lifeline, now not coming anywhere near. And the A1 Northumberland dualling decision delayed yet again, and our regional rail services still running on outdated infrastructure and rolling stock. With all that in mind, will the Prime Minister commit to funding to reopen the Leamside line from Gateshead to County Durham to take pressure off the East Coast Main Line and aid economic well-being movement of passengers and freight services in the North East of England, or is levelling up just a rhetoric?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what I would say to the honourable gentleman, obviously it wouldn't be right for me to comment on specific projects, but to give him a sense of our commitment, what I can tell him is that in real terms, since 2010, we have spent over a third more in central capital investment in northern transport every single year since 2010 compared to Labour's last 6 years in government, Mr. Speaker. That's what we're doing for northern transportation, and specifically when it comes to reopening and restoring railway lines, where was the first one we did? From Ashington to Blythe.
We're going to leave Prime Minister's questions there. We'll bring you anything important that develops later on in the programme. Let me introduce our guest for this part of Politics Live. For the government, Kevin Hollinrake, Business Minister for Labour, the Shadow Business Secretary and Trade, Jonathan Reynolds, and, of course, Nick Eardley, the BBC's political correspondent. Nick, this was not the start Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, would have hoped for, as this issue, this crisis over crumbling schools has unfolded. The list has been published. The Education Secretary said she was going to publish it by the end of the week. We have it here. The Department for Education has listed them all. What have we learnt from this list?
It's long. It's 147 in total. 19 schools have had to delay the start of their terms because of this issue. And I think we found 4 schools or colleges that have had to switch completely to remote learning because of RAC. And you're absolutely right, Joe. That was a tough session for Rishi Sunak. He did not want to be talking about this. And the reason it's tough is we've sat here on a Wednesday afternoon a lot and talked about problems for the Prime Minister, quite often problems from previous administrations, previous Conservative administrations, but previous administrations. I suppose there's a bit of that with this, but the problem the Prime Minister has is it's his decision-making.
It's personal.
He was Chancellor. Absolutely. I'm not sure he quite did enough to fend off those questions today, even borrowing completely from the Boris Johnson phrase book with that Captain Hindsight jab at Keir Starmer. But look, I think we got the gist of the Labour argument with one particular line from the Labour leader, that this was an inevitable result of 13 years of cutting corners. That's absolutely the political attack line you're going to hear time and time again.
I mean, to some extent, politically, obviously this is a very serious issue. Politically, it is a gift to the Labour Party, and they will certainly be making the most of it. In terms of what Keir Starmer is committing to. There's a lot of talk about the Building Schools for the Future programme that was cut in the wake of the financial crash by the coalition government, led by the Conservatives under David Cameron. I haven't heard yet a Labour shadow minister, maybe Jonathan Reynolds will tell us, that they are going to commit to restarting or launching a new programme to do exactly that.
Absolutely, and that is going to be the big pressure point for Labour. I don't think just over this, by the way. I think in general, when their conference happens in a few weeks, it's about trying to put some meat on the bones of criticism to say, what are you actually going to do about it? But yes, you're absolutely right. On the politics of this, there is no doubt that this is a really tricky one for the government.
Let's talk to James Saunders. He is the head teacher at Honeywood School in Essex, one of the schools on the list which has had to partially close due to what's called reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete. We will call it RAC for our purposes today. Welcome to Politics Live, Mr. Saunders. How serious is the damage at your school? Did you have concerns before this?
Yes, thank you. No, I didn't have concerns, but I was aware that we had RAC and that was being managed according to our RAC management policy.
When did you find out that your school was going to be partially closed?
Last Thursday.
Was it a shock?
Oh, yes, yeah. Yeah, I was just getting ready for the start of term, and then all those plans had to go out the window, and we had to put together quite a lot in a very short amount of time.
What have you done?
So we've got 22 classrooms out of action and 22 other spaces that ranges from our staff room, staff toilets, children's toilets, counselling space, medical room, offices, photocopying. So a lot of the infrastructure as well. That equates to about half of our school. The core subjects of maths and English, all of those classrooms are out, along with half our languages department and our humanities department and all of our computer suites.
Have you done enough, or to quote the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, have you got off your backside enough to do something about this?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, we've been pretty busy and we've been proactive. And I think, to quote, well, many people, we're often referred to as being thanked for working at pace. And indeed, I think we have been working at pace. Certainly the staff at Honeywood have. I just feel that there's too much red tape coming from the DFE, and they're not working at the same pace, and we really need them to catch up with us.
Well, let's ask the Minister here. Kevin, do you accept that criticism?
Well, we should obviously listen to people who are experts at the sharp end. But I think if we can, for a minute, try and take the politics out of this and put this in context, of course these are serious issues. There are 22,000 schools in England. This is affecting about 140 schools. That's less than 1%. So lots of worried parents at home right now don't need to worry, and this is being managed. What we've done is step in when we realise the serious nature of this, and that's based upon new evidence. We are addressing these problems and making sure our children are going to school. Even the ones that can't go to school should only miss about 6 days. So that's the context around this.
Right, James, what do you say in response? Is that your experience is going to be about 6 days of school missed?
No, and here's if we come back to that red tape business. If I were to just go along with the current plan and get the work done, it would be 6 months of disruption. Now, that doesn't mean they would be off for 6 months, but I can only get 3 out of 2 year groups into the school. So I've got therefore about 340 children that at any one time won't be in school. So it's going to be a significantly larger number than 6 days, that's for sure.
Right, well, that's a huge dent to
I mean, there'll be some
education.
schools that are specifically affected like that school, and clearly we need to do all we can, and we said we'll commit all the resources we can to help with these kind of problems. What I was talking about is an average across the board, because there's some real scaremongering going on right now about our kids being able to go to school and whether they can go to school safely, and the vast majority of them can.
James, you've asked for funding, haven't you, from the government, from the Department of Education. What have you asked for in the past?
Yeah, I mean, previously, before I arrived at this school, I've been here 5.5 years. I know that the school was looking to get a new build. I don't know if it was part of the BSF project or not, but for some reason that never happened. Since I arrived at the school, I have been trying to push to get a new building. I believe our our plans were sent to Gavin Williamson during the pandemic for the new programme that he'd launched. And yeah, we've got all new schools around us, and we are one of the most crumbling buildings there is in this particular area.
Right. Well, why hasn't that school had funding?
Well, I can't obviously be specific.
But it should have done,
specific example. Well, obviously, I've heard what the head teacher has said. Is lots of other schools have been refurbished. What we've seen over the last 10 years is 500 schools have had this had building work done to them, which is a long-term average. We see over the next 10 years, 500 schools work will be completed against those schools. 50 a year, that's the long-term average, that's what's been done. We increased funding by 20%, £2.6 billion per year over this Parliament. So work is happening. Of course, I can't comment on the specific example, but I'm sure the Department for Education has heard what the head teachers had to say.
Right, I mean, Jonathan, if you become the next business secretary, can you commit to rebuilding James's school?
Well, look, first of all, let's pay tribute to Mr Saunders there, because that's a real public servant speaking, never mind government ministers demanding credit in the midst of all
And he wants his school rebuilt.
Absolutely. Well, the simple truth of this is that schools are just the latest thing to crumble in Tory Britain. If you weren't asking me a spending question about schools, you'd be asking it about the NHS, you'd be asking it about the courts.
I would, but I'm asking you about schools. Will you commit to rebuilding as part of perhaps phase 2 of building schools for the future, or BSF as James Saunders called it, in order to rebuild his school in Essex?
He will know, and you will know, I can't give a specific commitment to one school. The process has to be a little bit more involved than that. But Labour governments build schools. And specifically, I tell you what I really worry about, Joe. I worry about there are so many problems in this country right now, and talking to constituents over the summer, you know, I think people are losing faith that government can be better, that it can solve problems rather than create them. And I just say to people, look around, look at the history. This politics is ultimately, you know, down to decisions, to priorities. And the situation we're talking about here today is down to specifically the decision to cancel building schools for the future in 2010, and more recently the decisions that Rishi Sunak made as Chancellor when he was given information that showed the scale of the challenge and what he had to do. And he didn't choose to do that. That's what the debate in Parliament is about today. But yes, I want to see schools rebuilt. And one thing the Prime Minister said in PMQs that really got to me, he said, Labour's Building Schools for the Future programme was down to ideology. Yeah. Yes, that ideology was a belief that people in state education and deserve the very best schools. Not just adequate buildings, of course they should be safe, but buildings that tell our young people, we value you, you are a priority, and you will get the very best facilities.
That programme excluded 80% of all schools on an ideological
That's what he meant today.
Precisely.
Secondary school programme.
Precisely.
What
you weren't doing
Rishi
primary school.
Should be arrested for
also
statistics,
primary schools.
by the way. It was a secondary school programme. It would have rebuilt every secondary school in this country by 2010.
So will you start it again?
We would like, of course, to see that as a priority. I'm not going to give specific. We've got two fiscal events before you know, the next election. So obviously the baseline is what the government will be. But Labour governments are committed to state education, and we've already said how more resources would go into the state system.
James, what do you take from what you've heard from both politicians? Are you reassured?
Well, not really, no. I think the best way to sum it up is that I'm no expert on politics, so you know I'm out of my depth talking about politics with you all. But I am a bit more of an expert on education, so hopefully you'll listen to me more on that side. The problem is that we've got lots of competing ideologies, and we even have that in the education sector. You have progressives, traditionalists, okay, but it's a bit of everything all the time, really. You have to take from both sides of that ideology spectrum. So what we really need to do is, I think, take the politics out of education. Otherwise, we're going to get short-term ideologies that keep changing every time. I think that's the only way to sustain things going forward, so that we can have an agreement on what's going to happen to the fabric of school buildings, not just until the next point when there's an election, but actually long-term. I think it's the only way that we're going to make it work in the wider scheme of things.
Good luck with the school. I hope you get your pupils back shortly, in a few days, not weeks, as you fear. On the funding, Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, and reiterated by the Prime Minister today in the Chamber, that all the funding that is needed to get these schools, the 147 schools that have been thus far affected, will be provided. Where's that money going to come from? Is it going to come out of the existing education budget?
To be honest, that's a matter for the Chancellor, not for me.
But should it, or should there be new money provided?
That's a matter for the Chancellor. I'm not
do you
going
think?
to tell the Chancellor what to... I'm the business minister, Jo.
You are.
I'm not the Chancellor. He's obviously... We run this country, we look after the finances properly, we balance the books. So that's what Conservatives do. We've been through a very difficult time clearly because of COVID and the cost of living crisis. We've had to throw hundreds of billions of pounds at the economy. But I absolutely believe that Jeremy Hunt is the right person to make sure that money is spent wisely and not wasted, as we've seen with the Building Schools for the Future.
Yes, but can you can understand the suspicion of people when they hear commitments to providing money. It sounds as if there is some doubt that it could be new money. Existing budgets are already under pressure. And it would lead people to think maybe we just can't afford to have... Maybe we can't afford, as a country... Is that what the government is saying? What you're saying is that we can't afford to have safe schools?
I don't think that's right. Part of the 5 priorities the Prime Minister set out, including growing the economy and cutting inflation, as we are doing, is to bring debt down as a proportion of GDP, which is what's happening, and that's a responsible approach to take. But of course there will be situations like this that come out of the blue, where we have contingencies, where we can find the money to provide new money to schools, be for rebuilding costs, or indeed for temporary classrooms and those kind of things that's required, as the Prime Minister's committed to do.
Right, one of the issues, of course, is the level of investment over the last 13 years since the coalition government. Let's just show this graph so our guests, as well as our viewers, can see it. Education investment, you can see it there. Look at the 2009-10 levels of investment, up to £10 billion a year. Going right down after the financial crash and the response by the coalition government. It tips up slightly, but look at the 23-24 projection. Is that part of the problem, a lack of investment?
Well, of course, there was difficult times post-financial crisis, and we had to take some very difficult decisions.
But that was then.
What Rishi Sunak has done in 2021, increased the budget by 25%. It's increased over this Parliament by 20%, £2.6 billion a year, £15 billion since 2015. The same number of schools has been remediated over the last 10 years, 500 schools. The same over the next 10 years, 500 schools. There was no cut to the building programme, quite rightly, because this work needs doing.
Right, well, we can see the levels of investment. I understand that, but I'm going to put to Jonathan, will you commit under a Labour government next year, if you win the election, that you will return to the real terms, levels of investment of the last few years of the last Labour government?
Well, that graph is a graph of the last 13 years of power, which is cut investment, short-term decisions, sticking plasters, and when it all goes wrong and all comes home to roost,
so will you get back to that 8 billion, where that red line is?
We need to see an increase in capital investment. You know, I cannot promise that because the strength of our economy has to be improved before you can make those decisions on public services. Let's be clear. For people in this country right now, their taxes are high by historical levels, their services are poor, and the heart of that is how the economy has performed for the last 13 years. So I always have to come on here and say, our plan is to make the economy grow faster, to give us the revenues. The reason Labour in office had higher levels of investment, the economy was doing better.
Yeah, but that's the government plan. But that's the government plan.
The economy was not doing better in 2007.
We're sticking...
I was in business at the time.
The global financial crisis, we're not going back to that.
No.
Like, the fact is, the economy grew faster, wages were better, investment was better as a result of that. So that's why my agenda, my role as the Shadow Secretary of State for Business, encompasses the things that will make this economy grow faster, to deliver and get back to the good days we had under Labour and not have stories about the failing public realm and the consequences of that for everyone across the UK.
I mean, it is about priorities.
It's very laudable to want to grow the economy more quickly, but be realistic. Our economy is the third fastest growing economy since 2010 in the G7. Only the US and Canada have grown faster. You cannot simply have some magic wand where you grow the economy more quickly. We want to grow it more quickly too, but this has been an exceptionally challenging time, including COVID, including the cost of living crisis. Our economy has grown the third fastest since the pandemic.
Yes, but
just be realistic, Jonathan. You cannot give people false hope.
I'm not giving them false hope. I'm going to give them specifics. If you take the period since 2010 when you came to power, the economy has grown very poorly by historical standards.
Third fastest in the G7.
You're talking about the pandemic revision, which is the last few years. Since 2010, it has not performed well. Productivity is the worst in economic history. in the UK. Real wages
Faster
are
in
falling.
Germany, France,
and our plans,
Italy.
a real industrial strategy, our green prosperity plan, making Brexit work, planning reform, changing the apprenticeship levy. It is not a magic wand. It is a package in aggregate to improve the overall performance of business investment and growth and wages and prosperity as a result of that. We're not offering people false hope. Sometimes people say,
well, no.
you should be offering
You're not
more.
offering anything
we are
different,
saying
one
we can
could
make
say.
the economy grow faster and get back to the good years under Labour for public service.
I mean, listening to this argument is going to be rehearsed and re-rehearsed in the run-up to the election, which probably starts now. We're going off to party conferences fairly soon. But it is true that whatever Jonathan Reynolds says for the Labour Party, they don't want to make any commitments at the moment to what they say is the mismanagement of the economy under 13 years of Conservative government. How difficult is that going to be? Both, is anyone listening to what the Conservatives are saying in the first instance, or have they just moved on to Labour and then wondering what is it a Labour government would do differently?
I don't actually think it's one or the either. I think what's going on just now, there are a lot of people, both Kevin and Johnny, I'm sure, would agree with this, over the road in Parliament who think that the Conservatives have lost already, that frankly people aren't listening, and that such are the problems that we cover every week on the programme that it's just going to be hard to get the upper foot back. But I'm not sure that's quite true, because I think over the next few months, the other question that we're going to be asking every week, particularly as we get closer to that general election, is, well, if there are problems, what do you do to fix them? And I think that's Labour's big kind of challenge just now, is to at some point move on from the saying this is the big problem to this is how we'd fix it. And I just wonder, Johnny, are we going to start to see that in a couple of weeks at your conference?
The first thing I would say on
or
that
is it going to be something that in the run-up to the general election you continue to kind of just say, well, the other lot have done a bad job, so just give us a shot?
Well, first of all, let me say there's not an inch of complacency on the Labour side. You'll find no one in the shadow cabinet thinking, you know, any vote has been cast for the next election, and we are conscious of where we're coming from and the need to pull in the support to change people's preferences.
I've spoken to shadow cabinet ministers who...
Well, they better not say that to me or Keir Starmer, I can tell you that. Look, first of all, I would say where there are major public service problems, we have allocated resources for those, but we do say how we'd raise that money. That's how we'll scrap the non-dom regime for the super rich, how we will change how private equity is taxed, for instance, that the taxation of private education is part of that. So we hypothecate those improvements. I think it's important to say on all sides where that money would come from. But we do also, particularly in relation to my agenda and the Treasury team, have to put out how we will see the economy grow faster than it has done for the last 13 years. Because if we don't see that, every single show you do from now on for years, not just months, will be about, OK, you want to do this over here, but how will you improve it over here? The problems are evident and will give people the hope to change.
But how are you going to instill trust in voters when the other big story today on the headlines of papers is Birmingham City Council, the biggest council in Britain, run by Labour, has gone bankrupt?
Well, look, Thurrock, Woking,
all right, I'll come on to that. I know we only got a few minutes.
Across the
board. Why has Birmingham, under Labour, been mismanaged? That's what the critics are saying. It's gone bankrupt.
Well, look, there is a specific issue around the equal pay claim, which is in the news today around Birmingham. But the fact is, look at local government in England across the piece. Whether an authority is a Labour-run authority, a Conservative-run authority, a Liberal and independent one, they are all in the same financial problems. And again, this is what I mean. We're talking about the state of education. We could talk about local government or the NHS or the criminal justice system. Wherever you look, it's failure,
Wherever you look, you see Labour not...
Right, but hang on, Kevin,
there is not a single public service in this country that works better today than when you came to power in 2010.
But Kevin has got a point. Let's have a look at these other bankrupt councils. And you can see there is a fair sprinkling there of Conservative councils. This is not primarily a Labour issue, although Birmingham is the biggest authority in Britain. Should more money, they've had severe cuts over 13 years to local government, to services, should more funding be committed to these councils who've been served Section 114 notices?
Well, there is more money going into Birmingham. That's a reality in terms of recent funding settlements. Yeah. But look at the problem specific problems with every single situation around this. Keir Starmer this morning blamed budget cuts in terms of Birmingham, but their own internal report, Labour, have called it dysfunctional, called it misogynistic. There are some real problems within that council.
So what's happened in Thurrock that's gone bankrupt?
And he knew, Keir Starmer knew about that.
I'll ask them, but what's happened to Thurrock Council? Northumberland Northumberland
There will be
and
specific
Northamptonshire.
situations with all those councils. I'm not acquainted with the specifics around those councils, but clearly most councils don't go bust. Most councils do manage to balance the books. These are challenging times. There's no doubt about it, particularly around social care, of course. But the reality is, Labour always talk a good game. Jonathan talked about stuff they're doing on non-DOMs and VAT on schools, taxing schools. There is a few £1 billion. Their commitment since Keir Starmer has been in power it amounts to around £100 billion of annual spending.
Well,
so you're not going to do all those things. You've given the country false hope.
Will you blame the Labour Council there in Birmingham for mismanaging what's gone on?
Look, the difference between Labour and the Conservatives is we do confront problems in our own party, and I've just come off the National Executive, my second stint on it. We are very tough in terms of demanding the right standard of representation where people have a Labour rosette on and are elected under and as Labour candidates. But you cannot look at that and seriously say anything other than there is a systematic problem in English local government that is based on the decisions, because people may be aware the council tax you pay is only a small bit of any local authority's budget. There are things that councils have to pay for, statutory services for vulnerable adults and young people that have to be paid, and the decisions you've made have directly led to that picture, and you cannot meet that spending on a local.
And on that note, I'm going to thank all of my guests for joining me today on this first Prime Minister's Questions back of the new term. I'll be back tomorrow. Bye-bye.
You know what they say.
You'll get square eyes.
They assumed he